We hear all the time that Israel wants peace. In fact, this came up now. Once again, the peace talks are falling apart, but Israel wants peace. Don't be misled. Israel really wants peace. Well, let's examine this, okay? So, as my father said after the war, Israel had an opportunity to establish a Palestinian state. Of course, they went on to completely build settlements and so forth and integrate the West Bank. In the mid-1970s, my father and other Israelis put together or formed an organization that was dedicated to this cause. The recognition of Palestinian rights to self-determination in the West Bank and Gaza, and the rights of Palestinians who remained Israeli citizens to full equal rights. Of course, two things that have not happened, don't exist today. As soon as my father and the others created this organization, they were contacted by the PLO. They were contacted by Yasser Arafat's top deputies in order to begin a discussion on how this might work. On the Palestinian side, these were officials of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. On the Israeli side, there were people like my father who used to hold high office, who were well respected but had no political power at all. In this picture, my father was with Essam Sartawi, who was a Palestinian ambassador in Paris for many, many years. They became very good friends. So they would go to meetings. At first they were in secret. They'd meet in Europe, they'd meet in North Africa. And whenever they would return, my father would always go and report to the Prime Minister. He still had that kind of access in those days. So the Israeli government was kept abreast and fully informed about these meetings. They wanted nothing to do with it. In 1983, a delegation, including my father, met with Yasser Arafat in Tunis. It was highly publicized. There were pictures. It was in the press. Shortly after that, in a move that was led by Shimon Peres, the Israeli Knesset passed a law that made these meetings illegal. The meetings of these Israelis of the PLO illegal. So that was the 80s. Another decade gone. Suddenly 1993 rolls around and it's the Oslo peace talks. The White House launch, September 1993, Bill Clinton is there, Arafat is there, Yitzhak Rabin is there, and they're signing Oslo Accords. Now by 1993, some of us of course are old enough to remember, the Soviet Union fell, the Berlin Wall fell, apartheid in South Africa fell, and there was a sense that Palestine is next. Peace was coming. So there was a lot of optimism. What people failed to realize is that by 1993 there was no more possibility to create a Palestinian state because there was no more West Bank. The West Bank was already fully integrated into Israel. Oslo was not an attempt to bring about peace. Oslo was an attempt by Israel to bring the Palestinians to surrender. And because the Palestinians would not surrender, there's no peace. Now people say that Oslo failed. Oslo did not fail. Oslo is a huge success. It accomplished exactly what it was set to do, to strengthen the Israeli hold on the country and its resources, and to make life harder for the Palestinians. When the Palestinians agreed to the two-state solution under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, they were willing to give up, or Yasser Arafat was willing to give up almost 80% of historic Palestine, the right of the Palestinians to return, and agreed to recognize and make peace with a very state that destroyed Palestine. And because he would go no further, he was accused of not making concessions. So when Bill Clinton brought everybody to Camp David and it didn't work, Arafat was blamed for not making concessions. Arafat was in fact the most consistent voice for peace in the Middle East for 3 decades. From the mid-1970s till the day he died in 2004. He was completely consistent in his willingness to make peace with Israel based on the two-state solution, the full West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem. Israel is not interested, was not interested, and still will never be interested. This is not what Israel is about. Now, you know, there's this letter to the Pope about the Palestinian children who are in prison. I think the issue of the Palestinian prisoners is one of the most important issues is it's hardly ever talked about. Israel holds thousands and thousands of Palestinian prisoners in its jails. Has done for decades. Israel calls them security threats, terrorists, and so forth. The reality, though, is, and this is according to Israeli researchers, Israeli papers, the vast majority of Palestinians in Israeli jails have never been charged with acts of violence. I'll say it again. The vast majority of Palestinians held in Israeli jails have not been charged with acts of violence, and this is by the very low standard of the Israeli military system, the Israeli military courts. According to them, a child with a rock is a terrorist, is a security threat. These are political prisoners, these are political leaders, intellectuals, clergymen, and others. And their crime is that they dare to resist. Now, we know that the world community has recognized the rights of people to resist. The rights of people to resist racist and alien colonial domination is legal according to international law. If Israel doesn't like Qassam rockets coming out of Gaza, Israel can end the occupation of Gaza and allow the Palestinians freedom. I remember my father being asked once, as a former general, he was asked, well, how do you talk to terrorists? He said, well, terrorism is a terrible thing. At the same time, when a small nation is occupied by a larger power, quite often terrorism is the only means at their disposal. At the same time, it's important to recognize that as is reflected in the prison population, the vast majority of Palestinian resistance has been like this, has been unarmed, has been led by people like Naim Atik, who are as far as possible, as far as you can possibly be, from thoughts of killing people or an armed resistance. Of course, the armed resistance gets all the fame, gets all the glory, gets all the press. But this is the reality. Now, I'm going to take you back for a moment to my own personal story. Some of you, I know the story because you've read the book or you've heard me speak, but in 1997, my sister's daughter was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. And I was already living in the U.S. at the time, and as you can imagine, this is big news in Israel. Whenever when there used to be suicide attacks, of course, this was big news. In this case, this was the granddaughter of a famous Israeli general who later on became an advocate for Palestinian rights. So it was even bigger news. When I heard, I took the first plane home. I reached my sister's apartment. It was packed with people who came to mourn, both Palestinians and Israelis, and the press, every news outlet, every news agency from every country, every language you could possibly imagine was there. And the questions are always the same. The questions are, well, first of all, who's responsible, then how do we get them, and then how many of them do we kill, and how do we make them, learn their lesson, how do we teach them, and so on. Well, my sister Nurit, who I think some of you have met, came out finally after the funeral. She said two things that I felt were earth-shattering. First thing she said was, in terms of revenge, retaliation, no real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. Don't talk to me about killing more people. The idea of killing people in response to somebody's death is deplorable. It's insane. And she quoted from a famous Jewish poet, Bialik, who wrote that even the devil himself could not come up with a vengeance that's appropriate for the death of a child. And as for who's responsible, she said, well, let's take a look. Who is taking Palestinian land, destroying Palestinian homes, throwing Palestinian fathers and brothers in jail, shooting Palestinian children in the schoolyard, depriving them of water, depriving them of freedom? Who's doing all of this? It's the Israeli government. And both she and her husband Rami said, we hold the Israeli government directly responsible for our daughter's death. Because what do we expect? Do we expect that we can maintain this brutal oppression against another nation and there will be no consequences? There will be no price to be paid? And of course innocents are going to die. This is the reality. And it's a reality that we have imposed upon the Palestinians. Now she's become an activist. She's written a great book about the Israeli education system. I recommend you check it out. It's called Palestine and Israeli School Books. It's a very good book. It talks about the racism in the Israeli education system. Her sons, her other sons, and her husband have all become activists. And I went back to the U.S., in San Diego, where I live. And well, how do you pick up the pieces? How do you go back to life after you carried the small coffin and took it to its final resting place? But I was very fortunate in that in San Diego, I found a Jewish-Palestinian discussion group, a dialogue group. And that was my first meeting with Palestinians. I was born and raised in Jerusalem. And you've been there, you've seen it. Supposedly a mixed city. And this is something that when I mentioned in South Africa, people knew exactly what I was talking about. Even though you have Israelis and Palestinians, it's a completely racist, segregated city. So as an Israeli, you don't meet Palestinians. First time I met Palestinians was in San Diego, and the chapter in the book begins with a line, my journey into Palestine began in San Diego. I was 39 years old. But beyond that, it was the first time that I was with Palestinians in the same place, and we were equal under the law. There is no place, not in Jaffa, not in the Galilee, not in the Negev, not in the West Bank, not in Jerusalem, where Israelis and Palestinians live under the same rules and laws, where Israelis and Palestinians are equal. And that was another thing that the people in South Africa could understand, that really powerful feeling when you're with the other suddenly and you're equal. There were no checkpoints, there were no laws, there were no curfews, there were no permits that they needed. And you could speak at eye level, you can talk to each other. And gradually I began hearing about the Nakba, I began hearing about this Palestinian narrative, I began realizing that there's a whole other people, there's a whole other country that I never knew, even though I was raised there and I live right next to them, and these are the Palestinians. And then I began to venture into Palestine and go into Palestinian communities and, drive into the West Bank and so forth. Now, the way the book ends and the way I'll end my remarks today, and I think this is something we all need to pay attention to, is where do we go from here? Accepting the state of Israel means accepting a single state over all of Palestine with exclusive rights for Jewish people. The only way to maintain a state like that is through a brutal regime, military regime, through a system that creates thousands of political prisoners and maintains thousands of political prisoners, through racist laws. Israel has to maintain the violence, Israel has to keep bombing Gaza, Israel has to keep killing Palestinians in the West Bank in order to maintain its existence and explain why there's no peace, so they attack and they blame the Palestinians. Through an education system that's a racist education system. This is the only way to maintain the Jewish state. So anybody who supports the state of Israel needs to own up to that. You need to own up to the fact that if we support the state of Israel, we're supporting a brutal, racist regime. And many people are okay with that. Many people supported South Africa when it was a brutal, racist regime. But we have to own up to it. Accepting the two-state solution, or talking about the two-state solution as though it's a solution, means allowing Israel to do everything and anything it wants and maintain this brutal, racist state. This is the reality. But there is another option. Like we saw in South Africa, like we saw in Latin America, there is another option. There is an option to remove the racist regime. And I would say that today, Zionism took the place of apartheid. We talked about an anti-apartheid movement. There has to be an anti-Zionist movement, an anti-Zionism movement. Removing Zionism and establishing a real democracy will allow Israelis and Palestinians to live together in peace. Israelis are not going to like it, maybe at first, but privileged groups never like change. That's the way it is. But there is no reason why Israelis and Palestinians cannot live in a real democracy. The myths have to be brushed away. The fear has to be brushed away. We have to follow courageous leaders, and we have to line up clearly behind the banner of a single democracy with equal rights. You've been there, almost all of you have been there. You've seen it's a beautiful country with beautiful people with a great deal of potential. The only thing that's missing is equal rights. And for that we must fight. Thank you all very much.
What a privilege for us to hear this. These are prophetic words at a time where we need prophets. Miko, thank you for all you do. First question, I know you've been crisscrossing the globe lately, and probably South Africa and Europe are well ahead of where we are in the U.S. What should we be focusing on that we can learn from them at a moment of where all the resistance is here? What are some of the priority things that we should be doing and concentrating on?
Okay, I think we need to be doing exactly what we're doing, because I think we're going in the right direction. I think this issue here in the U.S., certainly the U.S. is a little bit farther behind than Europe and South Africa on this issue. But over the last 5 years, I think everybody that was here, that spoke here, agreed and mentioned this. There's been a massive change. thanks to student organizations on campuses that have been courageously leading this and exposing thousands of students to the Palestinian voice and to the cause of justice in Palestine. Thanks to BDS. 5 years ago, you'd say about BDS, nobody knew what you're talking about. Today, AIPAC is sweating over it. Bibi Netanyahu in his office in Jerusalem is worried about it. Things are changing, and they're changing rapidly. So I think the only difference between here and other places is that they started earlier. They've got better, perhaps, access to information. But I would say just do more of the same. Make sure that if you're buying product, BDS is probably the easiest thing to do. And there's a whole host of things that can be done. But BDS is probably the easiest. You don't buy. You boycott. You go to the local Whole Foods and you say, this is made in Israel. I'm not buying this. I'm not coming back. If enough people do that, that makes a difference. So just do more of the same, I would say, and expand all of this. This is exactly what needs to be done because I think we are going in the right direction.
Well, we're certainly not going to get to all these. Miko, are you able to make any inroads in the Jewish congregations and organizations as you do in the Christian communities and the secular groups?
Good question. Yeah, thanks for that question. Something I was going to mention in terms of all the myths. There's a myth that there's such a thing as a Jewish community. There's no such thing as a Jewish community. There are many communities who are Jewish, that are Jewish. You've got the Orthodox, the Ultra-Orthodox, the Reformed, this, that, the other, the Zionists, the non-Zionists, and you've got people in the middle, which I think are the majority, who really don't care that much one way or the other about this issue. There are Jewish communities that care about this issue as all of us here do. Typically, they come to events like this, or they sponsor events that are inclusive. And so, certainly the Zionist community doesn't invite me. The Orthodox community doesn't have that much of an interest. The Jewish community does have an interest in this and supports the cause of justice, are usually not exclusive. When they hold events, I'm talking about groups like JDP, for example, they're here. They come to events like this. It's always inclusive. They're there with the student groups. They're there with churches. They're there in peace and justice groups. They don't stand up and say, I'm Jewish, I'm Jewish, I'm Jewish all day. They say, we are human beings and we support the cause of justice. And that's, I see those people everywhere. I see those people.
Okay, maybe a good follow-up to that one. Are there courageous leaders in Israel for your vision? Are they speaking out for the change that's needed?
Not many, there are a few. I think probably the most courageous, well, let me backtrack. First of all, I'll say, I don't remember, there were not a lot of whites in South Africa that welcomed the end of apartheid. So you're not going to find a lot of Israelis who are going to welcome the end of Zionism. When you're privileged, you don't welcome change. In fact, they fight hard to maintain their privilege. There are, however, very courageous Israeli activists, Israelis who refuse to serve in the military, Israelis who march in the local protests, part of the popular resistance in the Palestinian and West Bank and other places. So there are, but they're not vocal, they're not that many, they're not that, it's not that sense of leadership, it's more a sense of people who are grassroots, who are working on the ground. I will say something about the refusers though. People refuse to serve in the Israeli army. In Israel, the draft is mandatory, but it's very easy to get out because the army is too big and really Israel has no enemies. So the only enemy is the Palestinians, and of course Palestinians have no guns, they live in a Palestinian tank. So Israel doesn't really have a military threat. Maybe in their minds they do. So the army's too big, so on one hand they don't want to cancel the draft, on the other hand, if somebody's not motivated, they're not interested. So it's very easy to get out. You have a headache, a backache, you miss your mom, you eat in bed. It's easy to find an American president. It didn't start with the president. An American president was still promising millions and billions of dollars to support our most important ally in Southeast Asia, a country that, by the way, no longer exists. In the end, he was forced to give it up and bring the forces back. So, that's not where it starts. I think Congress is going to be last. Politicians are going to be the last ones. They're going to see that the tides have changed, that it makes more sense to get elected easier if you don't support racism and apartheid, then they'll stop supporting racism and apartheid. So that's why this is so important. Because this happens first. This is how things change.
There's a few questions about BDS here, and maybe I'll try to combine them. Some boycotts target only products and settlements, but if Israel-Palestine is functionally one country, why should this restriction be maintained? And what must we as U.S. citizens do to make a more forceful impact with BDS now?
Yeah, this whole idea that you boycott only products from West Bank settlements and not products from settlements in other parts of the country is absolutely absurd. It's absolutely absurd. First of all, there is no difference. Number two, even if there was a difference, you couldn't tell the difference. It says made in Israel. It doesn't say made in Afra or Ariel. It doesn't say made in the West Bank. And third of all, like I said, imagine you buy an apple. And the apple was grown in a kibbutz somewhere in what is, not the West Bank. Do you know where the water came from? Can you check? There is no difference. The boycott, the BDS movement is like Mattityahu said last night, thank God for BDS. I never thought I would hear a clergyman say that. Thank God for BDS. That is the name of the game. The BDS, the boycott, the divestment sanction has to apply to everything that is Israel. Everything. There is no difference between West Bank and And it's time to get over this silly argument that somehow, well, we shouldn't boycott academics because academics are this. Or we shouldn't boycott these people because where are the academics? Where are they? First of all, so many universities are sitting on Palestinian land. Number one. Number two, why are they not out there demanding the end of the siege of Gaza? Why are they not out there demanding release of political prisoners? Why are they not out there? And since they're not out there, they are complicit. And that's the reality. That's the way it is. The boycott has to be across the board.
Okay, a kind of appeal and then the last question. You mentioned the prisoners and this letter to the Pope. The letter to the Pope is really a vehicle to raise this issue because it's not being discussed. That two Palestinian kids a night are kidnapped, pulled out of their houses, or in other ways are interrogated, tortured. It is trauma to families, to children, that we're raising this to stop. I know you've got a real passion for Palestinian prisoners and concern. I've even heard you say you're thinking of a next book on that. Say a little bit more. You mentioned it, but why is this such a pivotal issue?
Well, for several reasons. First of all, Israel claims to be a democracy. But what democracy holds thousands of political prisoners? Number one. Number two, the United States. In fact, I mentioned what I'm hoping to write about next. It has to do with Palestinian political prisoners in this country. So, number two, they say Palestinians are one of the most incarcerated people in the world. And if you've been to the West Bank and Jerusalem and Gaza, you're not going to find a single family that doesn't have either a loved one in prison or a loved one that was in prison at some point. No serious discussion, no serious decision, no serious negotiation will ever be done without an okay from the prisoners. And the prisoners who are released are a major force. They are like heroes. They carry the fact that they were prisoners like a badge of honor, as they should. They are political prisoners, and they are part of the resistance. And I think the release of the prisoners is going to be part of the downfall of Zionism. Some of you may recall when de Klerk announced the end of apartheid. He said Nelson Mandela will be released without conditions. About 5 years before that, they wanted to release him, but they had a whole host of conditions. He said, thank you very much, I'm going back to my cell. And finally they said, Nelson Mandela, and of course that means all the other prisoners as well. Prisoner release, unconditional release of prisoners is what is not going to happen until it's all over. So until we get our act together and force the end of Zionism, and push for the end of Zionism, these people, some of them in jail without trial, some of them children, are going to remain in jail for years and years and years to come. And as people are conscious, I think we can't allow this to happen. I think we have to do something about it.